So this lecture is about emotions and the brain, and it's also about stress, anxiety, fear, kind of brings everything all together. If you ever want to read a really good book about the neurology and physiology of emotions, this book is really good, The Emotional Brain by Joseph Ledoux. We're going to talk a lot about Dr. Ledoux in this lecture because he's done a lot of the pivotal work in the brain's response to emotions. Well, when we talk about emotions, we see a lot of changes. We see a lot of facial changes in emotions, especially in primates. We see physiological changes, both hormonal and neurological, and in terms of brain chemistry, neurotransmitters, and of course behavior. I mean, behavior is something we see in very specific ways when it comes to specific types of behavior. And of course, nothing motivates us more than emotions. Fear is a great motivator, so is happiness. When we use a term to talk about emotions in psychology, we oftentimes use the word affect. Like an affective disorder is an emotional disorder. So if you come across that, you're really talking about relationships to emotions. Well, a lot of people categorize emotions in different ways. There are subcategories within each category. These 5 emotions, love, surprise, sadness, fear, and anger and disgust, are oftentimes put as the top 6, and then each one of those has some subcategories. And animals show emotions, not just humans. Animals have a wide variety of emotions. This is a very famous picture I took from National Geographic a few years ago. It's about animals at play, and that playful behavior is a big part of their emotional life. Here is an example of a polar bear and a husky who sometimes can be enemies, but one day the polar bear comes over and shows some symbols in terms of its outward expressions, usually body expressions, that it wanted to play. It needed some play, and the husky was happy to join in, and they play. And since this has been documented, it's been found in a number of cases. Now, Paul Ekman looked a lot at reading emotions through the face, what he called micro expressions. Little expressions of the face can be very specific about the emotions people are feeling, not to mention the fact that these expressions are very hard to mask or to change, especially around the eyes. In fact, they made a TV show kind of about his work called Lie to Me, and the idea was that this detective could determine if people were telling the truth or had other hidden emotions by their facial expressions. So when we talk about emotions, especially in humans, we are very much expressive, not only in the words we say, but in the expressions we have on our face and our posture. Expressions, especially around the eyes, are very telling. So here are a bunch of different emotions, and you can really look at each one of these and determine the emotions that this person is experiencing. Our different parts of our brain can be sensitive to different emotions or to emotions in general. For example, which of these 2 faces looks happy? Just look at them, make a judgment, point at one. Okay, most of you said this one. This one looks sad, this one looks happy. Well, the truth is that those were just mirror images of each other. Here is one image that looks sad. Just simply flip that image and it looks happy. And the reason is that when you look at this image, this part of the face is being interpreted by the right hemisphere, and this side of the face is being processed by the left hemisphere, and the right hemisphere is a little bit more sensitive to emotions. So this expression of the smiley face is what is coming to mind right away. Another way emotions are used, and this is what I do in my lab, is I look at emotional relationship to decision making. And so I measure physiological responses like a skin response, heart rate response, facial expressions while people make decisions. And there's a theory here by Antonio Damasio, that's Antonio Damasio, called the Somatic Marker Hypothesis. And his idea, basically stated, is that the body knows about the goodness of the decision really before the conscious mind does. And the body will react emotionally, the somatic system in the body. This emotional feedback will then be interpreted by the conscious mind, and the conscious mind will essentially alter its decision making so that decisions are made correctly based on really the feedback of the emotions that the body is feeling. Now, the part of the brain that is thought to deal with those markers of whether the decision was good or not is called the ventromedial prefrontal of the cortex. That's right there. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex is an integration of the emotions and the decision process. Here is an example of one of his works that he did. People had to make these decisions about things. In each trial, they made a decision about whether one card deck that was red produced better long-term outcome than a blue card deck. And the decks had different money on them. And let's say the red card deck, sometimes you'd get $10,000, and sometimes you'd lose $5,000. And the blue deck was more of gain 1,000, lose 500, you know. And one was more profitable. In the long run, one was more profitable. And the question is, when do you make the decision, I only want red cards or I only want blue cards? It takes about 50 trials before people stick to one deck. But the emotions of picking the wrong deck begin to show themselves in skin response and heart rate at about 25 cards. In other words, the body starts to realize you're making a wrong decision. And what we know is that people with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex have a very difficult time making decisions. You know, when you go to make a decision about a roast beef sandwich or a turkey sandwich, you're at the store, at the deli, and you say, should I have roast beef or turkey today? Well, you're really using some emotions to make that decision. A lot of our consumatory decisions in the market or buying clothes, they're very emotionally driven. Somebody with damage to the prefrontal cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, cannot make those kinds of decisions easily. They weigh on them back and forth. Which do I want better? Which one is better for me now? Instead of just going with a quick decision. So the idea is that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is really about tapping into the emotions of the decision and helping convert that to an actual action. All right, well, let's look at fear. Because of all the emotions to investigate neurologically, fear is probably the easiest one. I mean, sure, people look at happiness or exciting or disgust. Those are investigated, but fear is something that's really inherent in all types of animals, even insects. Fear is, I need to save my life, you know, and so there's a lot of mechanisms to learn that's a fearful place. Don't go over there. There's a predator there. Don't go over there. There's danger there. I should learn that. I'll survive better. So there's a lot of genetics and evolution that goes into shaping a fear response. Fear produces really stereotyped behavior in, let's say, rats. Rats freeze, rats run away, rats fight, all depending on their level of fear and their level of ability to escape. So there's these genetic components. Animals come to the world oftentimes neophobic, scared of new things, especially humans. They aren't neophobic until they reach maybe 7 or 8 months, but then they begin to get scared of strangers. And it also involves very specific physiological and neurological components. The sympathetic nervous system, the limbic system, such as the amygdala. So I think for emotions, we're going to spend a little time looking at the physiology of fear. So the physiology of fear and anxiety. Now we can't look at things like anxiety. We can look at anxiety problems in rats. It's difficult to look at depression or schizophrenia because the animal models aren't as easily. So fear is a good animal model for investigating when fear responses go bad, when they aren't healthy, like panic attacks and anxiety disorders. So there's a series of areas, bunch of areas that are actually deeper in the brain that are thought to be part of or categorized as the limbic system. So the limbic system is part of the old brain. Sometimes we call that the Periaqueductal, and it regulates a lot of functions that go into survival. So the old joke is that the limbic system is important in the 4 F's of behavior: feeding, fighting, fleeing, and sexual behavior. That might take you a second. And the limbic system is several structures, and sometimes people do think about its connection with the cerebral cortex, but it can also motivate behaviors, dictate behaviors that go beyond the realization, the consciousness. So let's look at a few important structures of the limbic system. Well, the amygdala, of course. The amygdala helps to learn about fearful stimuli, emotional stimuli, has a lot to do with emotions. If we remove the amygdala in an animal, it's not as fearful. There are some disorders where people have damage or problems with their amygdala. They have a real bad problem with different types of emotions, appropriate behavior in public, things like that. It's also a place where we kind of store these unconscious associations of bad things, and it can be where we associate traumatic events. Uses long-term potentiation, just like hippocampus. The hippocampus also can learn about emotions and retrieve emotions, but it's not so much about learning simple things, like a simple phobia, like spiders are scary, but larger contexts. If you're talking about animal models, the amygdala might register a tone and shock. The hippocampus might register this whole cage, or this area of the cage, or this tunnel, or something like this. This larger space is associated with fearful things. They work together, the amygdala and the hippocampus. Another area that gets information from the amygdala is the periaqueductal gray, the PAG. And this is getting signals from the amygdala and the hippocampus, and animals will show very specific behaviors depending on the area of the periaqueductal gray, the PAG, that is stimulated. Okay, we'll come back to the PAG in a little while. And of course the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is regulating a lot of hormones that are important in regulating stress responses to fearful things. And so at the end of the lecture, we're going to talk more about the hypothalamus and its role in response to fear. And of course, the thalamus is part of the limbic system. It's connecting all these areas. It's helped routing sensory information, auditory information, pain information, so it gets to the right place. So here's a picture of the limbic system. There's several areas of the limbic system. Hypothalamus, there's the amygdala. The amygdala is Latin for almond, so it looks like a little almond there. And then the hippocampus. Hippocampus is Latin for seahorse, because it kind of looks like a seahorse, I guess. There's a cross section, a coronal section of the activation of the amygdala. You can kind of see where they are. There's the lateral ventricles up there. So the idea is, let's say somebody is scared of snakes, or even innately has a predisposition to be fearful of snakes, and you're walking along and you see something that looks like a snake. And the idea is that information comes up to the thalamus, and the thalamus kind of determines that looks enough like a snake, and sends a signal to the amygdala, and the amygdala reacts. This is before the consciousness of that is a snake. The heart rate increases, the adrenaline increases, the fearful response increases even before the realization. And let me give you an example. Let's say you are scared of snakes and you're walking along, and there's a branch on the ground. You're out in the mountains, and there's a branch on the ground that's kind of serpentine. It's kind of looks a little like a snake. You might jump. You might have a heartbeat increase. You might take a deep breath and jump, even before you look down and say, "Oh wait, that's just a stick." The thalamus said, "Close enough. Get out of the way. Close enough." It's one of the reasons why the rubber spider trick that you lay down on a string onto somebody's shoulder always gets them, because the conscious brain can later say, "That looks rubbery spider to me," but the thalamus and the amygdala and the limbic system doesn't care that it is a rubber spider. It's close enough, and you'll have a reaction. So let's take an example of how things are learned to be fearful, how you're to learn to be scared of things. Let's take a simple experiment. You have a little rat, and the rat, you ring a bell or play a tone, you go beep, and that beep is followed by a shock right to its feet, probably about a 1 amp shock. It hurts a little, it's discomforting, it doesn't cause any damage, but what happens is, and this is what Ledoux and his researchers mapped out, is that there is a connection of the auditory stimulus through the auditory cortex and the thalamus, and a connection to the lateral nucleus of the amygdala from the pain receptors. So the auditory cortex and the pain receptors, or pain perception, meet in the lateral nucleus of the hypothalamus. This is where an association is created, a Pavlovian, a classical conditioning, the tone signal shock. This is where that connection takes place. It uses long-term potentiation, just like the hippocampus can. And we know that if we destroy the lateral nucleus of the amygdala, the animal can't learn to be scared of things like this. The lateral nucleus sends a signal to the central nucleus. It does it through this other area we'll talk about in a second, but it gets to the central nucleus. And the central nucleus sends signals a lot of places. It sends signals to the periaqueductal gray, it sends signals to the hypothalamus, it sends signals to the hippocampus, it sends signals to a lot of places to say, show that reaction, show the freezing response, high blood pressure, startle reaction. If we lesion the central nucleus of the amygdala in a rat, it won't react to fearful stimuli. Even though it learned it, it won't react to it. So, sensory information into the lateral nucleus, sensory in the form of pain and tone. Then that goes to the basal nucleus, that's the one I was telling you about, but eventually gets to the central nucleus, and the central nucleus sends its signals all over the place, including to the area of the brain that's going to regulate muscle movement. It's why you jump when you see the snake. So the lateral nucleus is where connections are formed, information from the thalamus, the hippocampus, other areas, it's where it's formed. And the central nucleus is where information is projected to do something about it, to show that fear response. Central nucleus goes to all these areas. I don't need you to know all these areas necessarily, but you should know a few of them. Look at the locus coeruleus. Remember that from sleep? They had arousal, the norepinephrine, it arouses the animal. If it's scared of something, it should arouse the brain. There's the periaqueductal gray down there for freezing or jumping. The lateral hypothalamus for hormone release and stress responses, sympathetic responses. So let's take a look at the PAG, the periaqueductal gray. And there was some research done where if you take a live cat and you stimulate the ventral PAG, the ventral portion of the PAG is down near the brainstem. It surrounds an area called the aqueduct. It's part of the ventricle system for cerebral spinal fluid. If you stimulate the ventral PAG, the animal will show aggressive behavior, attack kind of behavior, both in its body position and its facial expressions. We'll get to that in a second. If you stimulate the dorsal PAG, the animal shows defensive posturing. Like it's being threatened, it's not threatening itself, it is defending itself. So let's say, for example, you have a male rat and an intruder male rat comes in. Well, they get into this very specific behavior where they kind of box each other. We call it a boxing behavior. But the intruder rat just wants to get away. It's defensive. Its dorsal PAG is very active. But the male rat that lives there, it's protecting its home range, its ventral PAG is very active because it is very threatening and attacking. Okay? And so this is the invading one with its dorsal PAG trying to cover its face and stomach, and this is the attack one trying to go for the back because they typically bite on the back. So here's the PAG again. The periaqueductal gray kind of surrounds the cerebral aqueduct. And like I said, if you stimulate it, like for example, if you stimulated the dorsal PAG, then the animal has this expression, but the ventral PAG, it has this expression. Okay, I'm just kidding. Actually, animals do have, cats do have very specific facial expressions. This is a very defensive, we call it the kind of Halloween cat look, very defensive. This is very offensive. The ears are forward. If the ears are back against the head, it's very defensive. If the ears are forward, it's very offensive. And if you stimulate different parts of the PAG, you're going to get different facial expressions in the cat. So let's get into some human stuff, and we're going to talk about when these fear responses can get disruptive and problematic. So anxiety disorder, there's several versions of anxiety disorder. Panic disorder, these are really the fear response. So the part of the brain that's dealing with fear responses can have an overreaction, an anxiety disorder problem, which is really an activation of the fear center, or a sudden onset of fear and anxiety, sudden onset, and that's more of a panic attack or a panic disorder. This is reported more often in females than males, though that's probably a little bit of a societal willingness to admit for these anxiety disorders or panic disorders in males. But remember, a lot of times this is the system having a problem, system not working right. And there's medication for it. There's also behavioral therapy for it. There's ways of dealing with it. So let's look a little bit at some of the neurology, a little bit at the neurochemistry. The structures involved in anxiety disorder, of course, the limbic system, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala. We also can get spontaneous activity of locus coeruleus, which is that norepinephrine flood, right? And that if that came on suddenly, sometimes people can feel a panic disorder, panic attack coming on, or if the locus coeruleus is just overactivated, that's a sense of arousal that might not be warranted for the situation. The neurotransmitters involved are norepinephrine, serotonin, and GABA. Sometimes it's a problem of GABA activity not being high enough, because drugs that are given to help people with anxiety oftentimes focus on increasing GABA. So there's behavior therapy of ways to deal with those problems. There are drugs. There are the benzodiazepines. Drugs that reduce anxiety are known as anxiolytics. Lytics means to destroy anxiety. So benzodiazepines are oftentimes given. Diazepam, which is Valium, that's very highly prescribed. There's a number of these on the market. The number one anxiolytic that people take is alcohol. Alcohol is an anxiolytic, and this is why if you're taking one of these drugs and drinking, that's extremely dangerous. So Valium and alcohol do not mix. And these drugs, like alcohol, have problems with addiction and tolerance. You have to take more and more of them. These are GABA agonists. They promote GABA. They increase the activity of GABA. Increasing activity of GABA can also increase the activity of dopamine. Dopamine has a lot of functions in addiction. So if you look at a GABA receptor, I just want to look at it and just point out that here's this GABA receptor, and it has a place for GABA to fit. GABA comes over, acts on this receptor. But here's a place where barbiturates fit. Here's a place where ethanol, alcohol, fits. The benzodiazepines fit, all affecting GABA. Panic attack can also be the sudden activation of a fear center or an over-arousal center. So imagine you're riding a roller coaster and you're feeling the adrenaline and the heart's racing and you're all scared. That's appropriate. That feels good, right? But what if you were just sitting around doing nothing and all of a sudden you had this overwhelming sense of fear? This arousal of the body and the brain can be a panic attack, having problems with breathing. It also can be associative in the sense that whatever you're looking at, whatever you're thinking about watching, and you have a panic attack, can associate to fear. Let's say you're outside and you have a panic attack. Well, the stimuli outside are associated in the lateral amygdala with fear, with this fear response. So people with panic disorder oftentimes are agoraphobic. They are scared to go outside or social places. Some other things that can induce these things: caffeine, sometimes CO2, lactic acid buildup. These things have been known to increase the likelihood of a panic attack. Some things that help with panic attack is the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. This is the number of panic attacks by people who suffer them, and this is when they're on fluvoxamine, and this is a placebo, and you can see that they can be beneficial. So what about stress? Stress is a really complicated thing. We can talk about chronic stress. We can talk about acute stress. Chronic stress is kind of the day-to-day stuff. You have to study. You have to study a lot. What about the money? I have to pay for this. I have to get food. I don't have the time. I don't have the energy. These are the chronic stresses that we experience in life. Acute stress happens more quickly, and more importantly, it goes away. Riding a roller coaster is an acute stress, but it goes away. Seeing a scary movie, while you're in that movie, you're stressed out, but when you leave the movie, you're not continuously stressed out. So chronic stress, especially in the way you perceive it, can be extremely damaging. I mean, I think one of the most important things to understand, really important, is to understand that chronic bad stress can physiologically damage the body. It affects the thymus gland in the immune system. It affects the adrenal gland. It affects the hippocampus. And you have memory problems. Chronic stress is a really bad thing. People and animals die from just a chronic stressor. And acute stress can be bad, but also can be good. Running isn't a stressor, but it can be really good for you. Watching a scary movie or going bungee jumping or something like that. While it's very terrifying at the time and it's kind of fun, it can actually reduce the effects of some of this bad, what we call distress. Eustress is good, distress is bad. So if somebody has long-term chronic stress and they're not managing it well, they're worrying about things, worrying about relationships, worrying about money, worrying about time, having their world as unpredictable, uncontrollable. You get into learned helplessness. These are some things that happen. You have allergy problems and headaches, immune systems, sleep disturbances, indigestion, cardiovascular, because a chronic stress is going to be elevating your heart rate and elevating your blood pressure, and that can cause damage. So if you look at this years and hypertension, this is where the blood is pushing too hard through your blood vessels. Low stress, high stress. This is damaging. Hypertension leads to heart attacks and strokes and kidney problems and all these things. And this is stress. This is stress related. And some of the psychological symptoms: anxiety, depression, High levels of stress go with depression really well. Helplessness, irritability, low self-esteem, all these things can be very, very damaging. And I would imagine if you work with people and you want to help them, my first thing I would want to help them with is to manage their stress. What are they doing to reduce their stress? Sometimes stress leads to bad behavior, like bad diets. We know how bad diets are. And I would recommend to you as well, especially since you're college students and it's very stressful being a college student. What are you doing to manage your chronic stress? And exercise and meditation and doing fun things with friends. These are all good things to mediate stress. Alcohol is not a good, healthy way to mitigate stress. So let's look at the stress response. You have a fast-acting stress response and a little bit slower-acting stress response. The fast-acting stress response is the norepinephrine activation in the central nervous system, locus coeruleus, and the epinephrine or adrenaline release from the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla, in fact. And that can be activated through the sympathetic nervous system. It can happen very fast. You increase your blood pressure, you get glucose ready for your muscles, increase heart rates, eyes dilate, get all that light in there, just a general arousal to deal with that stress. Very quick. And if that happens, it can actually be okay and healthy, and if it goes away, that's fine. Okay, this is the fast reaction to stress. Okay, sorry about that. And in an acute stressor, there's a slower reaction, and this involves hormones. So from the hypothalamus, you get a release of a hormone called CRH, corticotropic releasing hormone. Corticotropin releasing hormone, which goes to the anterior pituitary and causes the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that goes in the blood down to the adrenal gland. And in the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal cortex, you get a release of cortisol. Sometimes it's called a glucocorticoid. And cortisol is good for you if you only have a little bit for the acute stress. It also helps with blood pressure. It also helps with memory. The NMDA receptors have receptors for cortisol. Helps in that memory. Because if you're an animal and you get stressed, it's probably not because you're at a movie. It's probably because you almost got attacked by a predator. It's a good idea to remember where that predator is and not go back. And it helps to release sugars and glucose and convert fat and increase blood pressure. But it also reduces sex hormones, counteracts testosterone, because if you're stressed, this isn't the time to be reproducing. And like I said, it affects the hippocampus. Now, what happens if the stressor doesn't go away? What happens if you don't get to leave the movie and the roller coaster never stops? And that's really what a lot of human existence is now. We don't live like we used to live. We have chronic stress because we do things like worry about the future. Okay? There's a great book by Robert Sapolsky called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And he said it's because zebras walking along, get chased by a lion, either you get killed or you get away from the lion, but then you don't worry about it. You don't worry about the lion, it's over. So they deal with acute stress, which the body is set up for. Well, we do. We worry about the past. We worry about the present. We think about the future. And not only that, but we add things to our lives that are very stressful. School and work and all these other things. And chronic exposure to cortisol. Long-term exposure to cortisol, well, then you get hypertension, diabetes, infertility, reducing healing, loss of memory. This is bad, and this can be extremely damaging. So if you're experiencing chronic stress, or your client is, this is going to contribute to many other bad behaviors. Bad behaviors such as drug taking, alcohol taking, eating bad starchy foods. Cortisol also contributes to addiction, and we'll talk about that in another lecture. So these are really important things to manage. So let's take a look. Here's that sympathetic nervous system going to the adrenal medulla. The adrenal sits on top of your kidney. The medulla is the middle, and you get epinephrine and norepinephrine released. Fast reaction, instant reaction. The slower reaction is the CRH is released from the hypothalamus, goes to the anterior pituitary for the release of ACTH, that goes through the blood and finally goes to the adrenal cortex, which releases cortisol into the blood. One happens in a matter of a second, and one happens in the matter of several seconds, even minutes. In my lab, we measure cortisol sometimes for research, and we want to know their cortisol levels about 10 minutes after the event that we think might be causing stress to them. Here's just another slide to look at the slow pace reaction, the 10-minute or so one, and the fast one. And you can see with those when the adrenal gland is. So what happens, here's just a few pieces of evidence about this. Here's a caregiver in pink here, and these are caregivers for people with Alzheimer's, which is extremely stressful to see someone you love go through Alzheimer's. And here's a control group that's not. And each one of these people were given a small cut on the hand, and then they were monitored as to how well it healed. This is just the healing of the immune system and the healing system. Caregivers who are under chronic stress don't heal as fast as those that are in the control group. Stress affects physiology. Keep that in mind. And sometimes these stressors are so bad that they reoccur in the brain, that they're replayed in the brain. So somebody in a war zone who, let's say, experiences an extremely terrifying thing, well, they might be out of that environment, but they are dreaming about it, thinking about it, stressing over it, and every time they do, they have this same cortisol release. They have the same stress reaction. So they are getting chronic levels of cortisol and chronic levels of the sympathetic nervous system. And that can be extremely bad. PTSD, some of the symptoms of PTSD is hypertension and bad memory and bad self-medication in both food and alcohol and other anxiolytics. It's a very dangerous thing. So this is the cortisol releasing hormone. This is corticotropic releasing hormone levels. This is somebody who has not dealt with a PTSD and somebody who does have PTSD. These levels are much higher, more cortisol, and it can be very dangerous for the health. These stressors can affect the immune system. As we think about how people fight off diseases. Let me ask you a question. When I was in college was very stressful. I remember that. And I would have the final exams. And I was studying and worrying, of course, and worrying. Right after finals, I always got a cold. I always got some kind of sickness. In other words, my immune system was so compromised that I was not fending off diseases. Now, you get affected by viruses and bacteria all the time, and fortunately you have cells like T cells that help to fight off the disease. Well, cortisol can affect the thymus, which releases T cells, and oftentimes people who are caring for somebody with Alzheimer's have problems with their immune system and their healing system. So there's the thymus gland, the spleen, the lymph nodes. These all can have problems with people with chronic stress. We know that because we can look at them with animal models. Put a little rat in a cage with all the water and food it can eat, and nice and healthy, and you put a cat next to him, and the cat can't get to him, but the cat's there, chronic stress, and you see damage to a lot of these immune system functions. You see levels of these and these T cells and these B cells and these things that help to fight off things like bacteria diminish, and people have bad responses. So, take-home story is chronic bad stress affects your physiology. It affects your health. It affects your behavior. Okay,